Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of the most iconic and widely celebrated series in recent memory, and for almost too many reasons to count. But if you were forced to choose one aspect as the deciding reason for its success, which would it be? A few answers that come to mind might be the intricate world building, creative and highly consistent magic system, well choreographed and animated fight sequences based on real-world martial arts, a lovable main cast portrayed by talented voice actors, the unique, East Asian-inspired setting and philosophies of the series, the groundbreaking nature of a Western children's animated show telling a serious, overarching story, or the excellent balance of action, comedy, and drama the series manages over the course of its 3 seasons. And while all of these are good answers, and the truth probably lies in some combination of them, from my point of view, the element that truly elevated Avatar: The Last Airbender was the arc of its original primary antagonist turned anti-hero turned hero, Prince Zuko. Voiced by the highly talented Dante Bosco, Zuko is one of the most popular characters to have emerged in the modern media landscape over the last 2 decades. And while this may now sound like hyperbole to some listeners, I truly believe he has one of the best written character arcs I've ever come across in fiction. I understand that the concept of a villain who gradually has more depth to their character revealed, is conflicted between their current state and a nobler one, and ultimately chooses the side of good is a path far from untrod in the realm of storytelling. But Zuko's arc contains certain unique elements that truly elevate it, as well as the show in which it features, to heights previously unseen in the realm of Western animation, and perhaps beyond. The opening 2 episodes of Avatar are, by my own estimation, some of the weakest in the series. The comedy is hit or miss, often much more childish and less clever than it is throughout the rest of the show's run. The art and animation simpler than what audiences will later be treated to, and the expository dialogue quite heavy-handed, dumping a lot of information on the viewer in ways you'd be hard-pressed to describe as subtle. But this isn't to say these episodes are bad, and in their own ways they do set the rest of the series up for success quite well. We are effectively introduced to our 3 main heroes and their primary antagonist for the first season, being shown their personality traits through a quick succession of interactions. Aang is affable, lighthearted, and free-spirited, yet trying to escape some greater obligation from his past. Katara is weighted down by the burdens of caring for her tribe after the loss of her mother, yet optimistic about the future. Sokka is cynical and sarcastic, but determined to fill the shoes of his warrior father and defend his people. The world is at war, and has been for 100 years, since the Fire Nation launched its devastating attack, and no one has seen an airbender for an entire century. We get shown how 3 of the 4 main bending forms work, and gain insight into the differences between them, how waterbenders can manipulate the physical state of their element, while firebenders can generate flames, that Aang and his newfound companions have access to a flying bison, and that the Fire Nation possesses far more advanced technology than the other nations. We are even given our first impression of the Avatar state, and Aang's lack of control over it. One of my favorite moments from the first 2 episodes is a brief exchange between Aang and Katara, after the former convinces the latter to go penguin sledding with him. Katara, only 13 years old at this point, laughs and says,
"I haven't done this since I was a kid! You still are a kid!"
Despite being roughly the same age, at least ignoring the century Aang spent preserved in ice, these 2 have quite literally grown up in different worlds, with different expectations and demands. A reality all too common throughout our own history, and one that still plagues parts of the world to this day. Zuko's introduction, like most of the other setups in these 2 episodes, is heavy-handed to the point of being comical, though to some degree this is deliberate, with the scarred prince fervently and repeatedly declaring that he must capture the Avatar to regain his honor.
"I need to capture the Avatar!"
I just said that.
Because their honor didn't hinge on the Avatar's capture. Mine does.
His uncle Iroh, the angel on his shoulder, urges him to not let his temper get the better of him, extolling the virtues of self-control and the basic forms of firebending. All fairly standard stuff you'd expect from the dynamic between a hot-headed, youthful antagonist and his older mentor.
No, power in firebending comes from the breath, not the muscles.
At this point, audiences have no reason to expect that Zuko is anything but a standard villain. His temperamental, boisterous, menacing, and melodramatic nature, quite cliché by most standards, almost serves to cloak the meaning behind his main drive, that he must capture the Avatar to regain his honor. As we aren't given any further information on how he lost his honor, or even what this means, nor how his scarring might be connected to this segment of his past, both of these elements of his character might easily be dismissed as mere decoration. After all, though scars are a prominent feature of many villains, they rarely play a significant role in who those villains are as people, at least as far as audiences are made aware. In fact, even Zuko's status as a banished member of royalty is downplayed in favor of his aggression and menace. But from his first antagonistic interactions with our heroes, audiences are shown a degree of depth. When Zuko storms the nearly defenseless Water Tribe village, cowing its inhabitants with a fiery display and demanding that they hand over the Avatar, Aang offers to surrender, showcasing our hero's initiative and willingness to put others' well-being before his own, while Zuko agrees to leave the innocent bystanders alone, demonstrating a sense of honor. In the resulting fight aboard the Banished Prince's ship, Aang manages to escape through an awesome display of power, and a seething Zuko is left stunned and furious. And thus, the main dynamic of Season 1 is established. Aang, Sokka, and Katara will be attempting to make it to the Northern Water Tribe so that the young Avatar can learn waterbending, while Zuko will pursue them. But the third episode immediately subverts this setup with a surprising twist. It presents a new antagonistic force in the character of the recently promoted Commander Zhao, an ambitious, ruthless, and even more temperamental Fire Nation officer. Where Zuko might have sufficed as a sole one-dimensional villain in an ordinary series, here the audience is enticed to sympathize with him just after establishing his status as a villain.
You're just a banished prince. No home, no allies. Your own father doesn't even want you.
By being shown his relative powerlessness in the face of more recognized commanders in his own nation's military, thereby making him an underdog that viewers can root for against an even worse foe, as well as further developing that his drive to capture the Avatar is rooted not in true malice, but a desire to simply return home, audience members find themselves cheering Zuko on in an Agni Kai against Zhao, as elsewhere in the episode, Aang makes the discovery that he truly is the last surviving member of his people.
Prince Zuko, have you forgotten what happened last time you dueled the Master?
I will never forget.
The ending of this episode, where Zuko spares Zhao after defeating him in a ritualized duel, thereby claiming the moral high ground while also humiliating the prideful commander, not only furthers our understanding of Zuko as someone reluctant to resort to brutality in a culture defined by it, but cements his rivalry with Zhao, a dynamic that will span the entirety of the first season, and contribute greatly to the Banished Prince's development. Over the course of the next few episodes, Zuko pursues the trio of heroes on their journey northward, and I think it's no surprise that the show's weakest episodes, The King of Omashu and The Great Divide, are two of the only ones to not feature the Banished Prince and his affable uncle. The dynamic between the two lends itself to plenty of great comedy.
Why don't you enjoy a cup of calming jasmine tea?
I don't need any calming tea!
The lotus tile was in my sleeve the whole time!
But it also helps us to learn more about who Zuko is as a person. Not a power-hungry tyrant or sadistic warmonger, but a deeply troubled adolescent trying to make sense of what his place in the world is, with his wise uncle gently nudging him in a better direction. When Iroh is captured by Earth Kingdom soldiers in Part 1 of the Winter Solstice double episode, Zuko forgoes a chance to capture Aang in favor of saving his uncle, an early example of the troubled prince doing the right thing when push comes to shove. And during the second half of the special, after risking his own imprisonment by defying his banishment in order to pursue his quarry, he is inadvertently saved when Aang enters the Avatar state. But the point at which Zuko's past is first explored in more depth, and not coincidentally where many believe the show itself went from good to great, is found in Episode 12, The Storm. The dark mirror is a common trope in fiction, itself a variant of the narrative foil, by which one character's traits or experiences are contrasted with that of another, in order to highlight either their differences or similarities. Think Gandalf and Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, Tony Stark and Steve Rogers in the MCU, or Obi-Wan and Anakin from the Star Wars prequels. While narrative foils don't necessarily involve violent conflict or moral opposition between the two characters, a dark mirror takes this contrast further, establishing a specific character as a fallen counterpart to a heroic one, with personality traits, life experiences, and goals that reflect those of the latter, only in a more villainous or unsavory manner. From his introduction, the show makes it clear that Zuko is not entirely evil, but audiences are still left with plenty of questions as to his past. And when both our heroes and their pursuers find themselves in the path of a devastating storm, we get a chance at receiving some long-awaited answers. After being berated for abandoning the world in its time of greatest need, and therefore sharing some responsibility for the century of suffering and warfare that engulfed the four nations in the wake of his disappearance, Aang flees to a cave, only to be followed by Katara. Meanwhile, tensions flare among Zuko's crew when his subordinates grow defiant in the face of the prince's refusal to postpone the chase, and apparent willingness to risk their own lives in pursuit of his goal. As Iroh explains his nephew's past to a group of officers while the storm rages around them, we cut between this conversation and the cave Aang has sought shelter in, where the young Avatar reveals the true reason for his surviving the Fire Nation's genocidal campaign against his people. While Aang fled, fearing the responsibilities of his status as Avatar, which were thrust upon him at a younger than expected age with war looming on the horizon, Prince Zuko instead sought out responsibility, attending a war council headed by his father, the Fire Lord. But when the young prince witnessed his country's military leadership planning to callously sacrifice a unit of recruits in order to achieve a greater objective, his moral code compelled him to speak out against this strategy, violating the Fire Nation's stern customs of honor that govern nearly every aspect of social interaction. Having assumed that the recipient of his insult was the aged general who proposed the plan, Zuko arrogantly agreed to an Agni Kai, only to find that, as the insult had occurred in the presence of the Fire Lord, it was the Fire Lord himself who had been dishonored by Zuko's actions, and therefore the young prince would have to duel his own father. After refusing to fight, an action viewed by his cruel, tyrannical father as a sign of weakness, Zuko was mutilated in front of the entire royal court, a permanent reminder of his failing literally burned onto his face, before being banished. And after all of this suffering and humiliation, he was left with only one hope for redemption, capturing the Avatar, who had not been seen for a full century, condemned to wander the rest of the world for what was intended by his own father to be a never-ending snipe hunt. The stories of Aang and Zuko share many parallels. Where the former hoped to flee from responsibility, while the latter sought it out, both were children whose entire worlds were taken from them by war. Both battle feelings of inferiority, and were made to feel like outsiders among their own communities. And both remain burdened with shame. Aang feels guilt over not being able to aid his people in their time of greatest need, while Zuko suffers the indignity of life as an outcast with royal heritage, unwelcome in his own country, unwanted by his own father. Both attempt to fulfill what they believe to be their destinies, Aang's to master the four elements as the Avatar, and Zuko's to restore his honor, and thereby redeem himself in the eyes of his father and nation. And both, having been cut off from their homes and families, are forced to form new bonds that will inevitably save them. At the end of this episode, as Aang finds comfort in the idea that he has a chance to help the world here and now, Zuko's crewmates come to a new understanding of the exiled prince, who repays this by risking his own life to save one of his subordinates, and then relenting when the Avatar's sky bison is spotted, deciding to prioritize the crew's safety over a chance at regaining all that he has lost. Though it may not seem like much at the time, through this little gesture we see that Zuko, like Aang, is capable of growth. And in the very next episode, The Blue Spirit, this connection between Aang and Zuko is developed even further when the newly promoted Admiral Zhao, utilizing an expanded set of resources, captures the young Avatar in the middle of an errand to aid his ailing friends. Imprisoned within an imposing fortress garrisoned by hundreds of soldiers, scheduled for transport to the Fire Nation itself, and with his plight unknown to his companions, it appears that Aang has no chance of escape. That is, until a mysterious masked swordsman infiltrates the prison and cuts his bonds. Though his identity is not revealed until the end of the episode, this silent rescuer turns out to be none other than Prince Zuko. Having been faced with the prospect of Zhao receiving credit for capturing Aang, and thereby losing his only chance at regaining his honor, Zuko decides that it is in his best interests to free the captive Avatar. As the two sneak and then fight their way out of the fortress, with Aang bending while Zuko sticks to the use of swords to avoid revealing his identity, we are shown that the two complement each other quite well, foreshadowing their eventual reluctant alliance turned genuine friendship. But despite aiding the Avatar, the Zuko who saves Aang here is far from the hero audiences will come to know in time. His motivations for rescuing the Avatar are purely selfish, with the Banished Prince going so far as to sabotage his own nation's war effort to preserve his one chance at redemption. And knowing that the Fire Nation needs the Avatar alive at all costs, he resorts to holding a blade to Aang's throat in order to follow through on their daring escape. When his mysterious savior is knocked unconscious by an archer, Aang gets the chance to unmask him, and despite his shock, the Avatar chooses to save his unlikely rescuer, giving us one of the most important early scenes in the prince's arc. As Zuko regains consciousness, he finds himself in a forest, with Aang, his quarry, sitting nearby. The young Avatar mentions how before the war, he had friends from all around the world, including the Fire Nation. Then, turning to Zuko, he asks,
If we knew each other back then, do you think we could have been friends too?
Zuko stares at him for a moment, as if contemplating the question, only to strike at Aang, who vanishes into the trees just as quickly. The Banished Prince is then left on the forest floor, staring after his fleeing quarry with a puzzled expression, pondering Aang's words in silence. Though the question appears to be quickly forgotten, it will resurface in various ways and be explored in further depth over the course of the series, and it is a subject worth exploring, one which I will venture into in more detail further on in this video. How the place and station of one's birth can come to define their life, for good or ill. By having Aang ask this of Zuko, the writers coax the audience into asking it as well. And not only about the Banished Prince, but those around us, and perhaps even ourselves. And I think it fitting that, as Zuko is forcefully confronted with this idea, we leave him at the end of this episode lying in the shadow of a massive Fire Nation flag, which he turns his back on when trying to rest. Over the remainder of the first season, Zuko's pursuit of the Avatar continues, but as an antagonist he is mostly shunted to the side to make way for Admiral Zhao, who continues to serve as a foe for both our heroes and Zuko himself. When Zhao discovers, or at least is given strong reason to suspect, that Zuko was the masked stranger who freed the Avatar from his clutches, the Admiral attempts to remove the prince as a threat entirely, hiring pirates to bomb his ship. Despite being severely injured in the blast, Zuko manages to survive this assassination attempt and sneaks aboard one of Zhao's vessels, aided by his uncle. Here, away from the pressures of leading a crew of their own, Iroh begins to nudge Zuko in the direction of good more firmly, challenging the troubled prince to truly ask himself what he wants, rather than simply accepting the roles he has been assigned by those with power over him. As audiences later learn in more detail, Iroh himself stands opposed to the Fire Nation's goals of domination, having become disillusioned with his country's path after the death of his son in battle, and the subsequent failure of his siege of the Earth Kingdom capital of Ba Sing Se. But having been passed over in the country's succession by the schemes of his murderous younger brother, and largely viewed as inadequate after his military failure, Iroh has little ability to effect change from within the system, except when it comes to Zuko. Having all but adopted his nephew as a surrogate son after the loss of his own, Iroh uses their time together during the prince's banishment to develop Zuko's moral character. By planting these little seeds in his nephew's mind, and nurturing them in a manner that avoids arousing the suspicion of Zuko or others, he helps to subtly steer the Banished Prince towards the path of good. In the two-part finale of Season 1, as Zhao's massive fleet lays siege to the capital of the Northern Water Tribe, a helpless, spirit world-bound Aang is finally captured by his Dark Mirror, who finds himself unable to properly escape with his prize. Here, as the two shelter in a cave to wait out a blizzard, Zuko reflects on his past and present, and the contrast between himself and his quarry. Mistakenly believing that Aang has had an easy life, a rather short-sighted assumption given the role he himself has played in pursuing the young Avatar across the world, Zuko remarks that nothing has ever come easy to him, where Aang is like his prodigious sister, born lucky while her brother was lucky to be born. But the troubled prince is capable of recognizing one vital truth, that the hardships he has endured have shaped him into the man he is today.
I've always had to struggle and fight, and that's made me strong. It's made me who I am.
In the climactic confrontation at the North Pole, Iroh is forced to reveal his true colors in the face of Zhao's plan to kill the Moon Spirit, while the Avatar's companions track down and easily defeat the snowbound prince. Not willing to let a helpless Zuko die, Aang chooses instead to save his foe from the raging blizzard. And in turn, as the Fire Nation forces flee from the might of the Ocean Spirit, and a vengeful Zhao seeks out Zuko, the Banished Prince likewise takes pity on his own nemesis when their fight is interrupted by forces far beyond them. As he watches a terrified Zhao being dragged into the depths by the spirits the man sought to conquer, Zuko's gut instinct is to reach out a hand to the Admiral, who, true to his character, refuses it, dying as he lived, belligerent, arrogant, and alone. In the aftermath of the battle, as Zuko and his uncle flee the devastation, each faces an uncertain future. Iroh is forced to worry if word of his treachery might have survived the siege, while Zuko has lost his best chance at capturing the Avatar. His sagely uncle, however, urges him to simply sleep and forget the demands laid upon him, telling his nephew,
"Then you should rest. A man needs his rest."
But unbeknownst to them, the Fire Lord has learned of both his brother's treason and his son's failure, and dispatches his own daughter, Zuko's sister Azula, to both bring her brother home and then complete his task for him. With Admiral Zhao dead, and Zuko having lost the good graces of his own nation as he begins to transition more prominently from villain to anti-hero, a new antagonist was needed to oppose our heroes, and audiences receive a proper introduction to her in the first episode of Season 2. While Zuko himself served as a dark mirror to our hero Aang throughout Season 1, the Banished Prince now receives a dark mirror of his own in his younger sister, the ruthless, ambitious, preternaturally gifted, and downright sociopathic Azula. Interestingly enough, the writers had already worked to establish her character from the middle of Season 1, albeit in a very subtle manner. When Iroh tells the crew of their ship the story behind his nephew's banishment, as the Fire Lord goes to strike his son during their fateful Agni Kai, the camera cuts to the assembly of officers and court officials watching. Iroh recoils in horror, while Zhao grins, and an observant audience member will also notice a then unintroduced Azula watching with barely contained glee. But while this glimpse and Zuko's monologue in the cave lay limited groundwork, our proper introduction to Azula comes in the form of her fantastic first scene. In contrast to her brother, whose first moments showed us a spoiled, temperamental prince desperate to accomplish his goal, our first proper look at Azula reveals a perfectionist who not only seeks but expects absolute mastery over herself and others, only losing her composure for the briefest moment when her bending technique is declared by instructors to be just a hair out of place. After Azula informs the members of the Royal Guard accompanying her of their mission, and reminds them that she will not hesitate to cut them down should they dither in carrying out her orders, the captain of the ship arrives with news that the tides will not allow them to dock. Twisting his wording, the Fire Nation princess casually notes that were she to have the captain thrown overboard, the tides would not think twice about dashing him against the rocks, with their conversation culminating in the line,
"Well then, maybe you should worry less about the tides, who've already made up their mind about killing you, and worry more about me, who's still mulling it over."
This glimpse into her personality is made all the more convincing by voice actress Grey DeLisle, whose performance was so strong that the writers decided to add this scene, originally planned simply to cast the role, into the finalized episode. Azula proves to be everything her older brother isn't. Naturally gifted, ruthless and remorseless, graceful and dignified, and above all else self-assured. Where Zuko has struggled to win the admiration and respect of others, Azula has never known anything else. And where the young prince finds himself torn between differing paths, his sister has never been forced to grapple with any such questions about her identity and nature. But the greatest irony is that while Zuko desperately wishes to be like Azula, it is his shortcomings that ultimately save him from suffering her eventual fate. When Azula tries to entice Zuko and his uncle to return home, she appeals to her brother's deepest desire, telling him that their father, concerned after a plot against his life, now values family above all else. Iroh is rightfully skeptical, but Zuko, distraught after once again losing the Avatar at the North Pole, and broken after his years of exile, is eager to believe his sister's promises. These promises, of course, turn out to be lies, and when Zuko and Iroh escape the trap set for them, they are declared fugitives from the Fire Nation, left with no choice but to go on the run in a hostile country, a country they have spent their entire lives at war with. Over the course of the next few episodes, as Azula supplants her brother in the role of the main antagonist for our primary heroes, we follow Zuko and Iroh not as villains, but refugees simply trying to survive in a war-torn world. And while Iroh himself has already had a change of heart, this experience proves crucial in developing Zuko's moral character, freeing him from the corrupting environment into which he was born, and allowing a better version of himself to shine through. The first illuminating experience comes when the two are briefly taken in by a local Earth Kingdom family, the first of many chances Zuko gets to see the effects of his nation's war from the other side. The family's daughter, Song, works as a healer, tending to the many soldiers and civilians affected by the fighting, revealing that her own father was taken by the Fire Nation when she was a child, likely to be forced into slave labor or killed, and that she and her mother were left with no choice but to flee. Sensing Zuko's past trauma, later that night Song attempts to get him to open up, revealing her own scars in what becomes a recurring motif. While Zuko himself is unable to acknowledge the damage done to him by his own family and nation on account of the circumstances of his birth and his ingrained sense of shame, others are quick to recognize the injustice he has suffered, even if they remain unaware of the details.
It's okay. They've hurt me too.
And as Zuko is forced to wander and beg, watching his uncle perform for amusement just to stave off starvation, his already wounded pride suffering further indignity, he resorts to stealing what he feels is owed to him as a crown prince, even if this title is no longer recognized by anyone but Iroh and himself. When this drives a wedge between the fugitive prince and his uncle, Zuko then sets out on his own, leaving behind the man who has long served as his moral guiding light in a terribly dark world. And here, we come to what might very well be the greatest episode in the series, and almost certainly my personal favorite, Zuko alone. In contrast to every other episode of Avatar, here the writers decide to forego giving viewers even a glimpse at the main heroes of our story, instead choosing to solely follow Zuko through several days in his new life as a lone wanderer. Structured like a classic Western film, we watch the exiled prince travel through a war-torn landscape before arriving in a small, dilapidated town, and nearly every single scene, every single shot, is packed with detail about not only this devastated world, but the characters who inhabit it. Right from the opening, a starving Zuko makes his way on the ostrich horse he stole from the family who provided him hospitality, a stark reminder that this is no selfless hero. Struggling forward under the scorching sun, his stomach rumbling, he spots a couple camped beside a tree, tending to a chunk of succulent meat roasting over an open fire, and his first instinct is to reach for his sword. But then he notices that the woman is pregnant, and after a moment's hesitation, he relents and presses on. Villainous as many of his prior actions have been, there are some lines that Zuko will not cross. While the title of this episode is rather straightforward, I think it encapsulates an important truth about who Zuko is as a person, one that is confirmed by the series' end, that when on his own, away from the influences of both his moral uncle and the father and nation who corrupted his soul, Zuko's true self finally has a chance to breathe. A sentiment echoed in Iroh's later line about losing his way only to find it on his own. Arriving at a rundown Earth Kingdom town, Zuko finds the populace living in fear of a brutal militia captain and his henchmen. He intends to simply resupply before continuing on, but when a group of children throw eggs at the soldiers, Zuko's instinct is to cover for them, a small altruistic gesture that tells us more about who he is deep down. And this kindness is repaid when one of the boys, Lee, invites the scarred stranger to stay with his family. Living in a world that has endured a century of warfare, Lee's family situation is tragically commonplace. His parents struggle to not only provide for themselves but support the ongoing war effort, while Lee's older brother has gone off to fight in the Earth Kingdom military. As he performs menial labor in exchange for food and a roof over his head, Zuko can't help but see pieces of himself in the clumsy yet determined Lee. Initially hoping to move on as quickly as possible, the Banished Prince finds himself instructing the boy in how to use a sword, all the while refusing to answer Lee's inquiries into his own past. And in a way, it almost seems that Zuko himself doesn't really know who he is anymore. Interspersed with this main narrative, we get flashbacks to one of the most important chapters of Zuko's life. And this is where another of the techniques employed across the series shines so brightly: the use of nonlinear storytelling to provide context for how and why Zuko became the man he is today, by showing us who he was before. We see that as a child, Zuko was rather ordinary, capable of cruelty, as shown with his treatment of the turtle ducks, but more importantly capable of remorse and growth. Despite being raised in the ruling class of a militaristic regime bent on world domination, taught from birth to see his side as justified, spreading prosperity and civilizing the world through their might, he was in many respects a normal child. Zuko's cruel father remained distant and dismissive, encouraging the villainous traits of his sister, while his kind-hearted mother guided the young prince down a better path. But in a culture defined by rigid honor and prioritizing an attitude of might makes right, Zuko found himself longing to be more like his ruthless and talented sister, developing an inferiority complex that he comes to spend the rest of his adolescence battling. For years, all he wanted was what so many boys desire: to prove himself worthy in the eyes of his father, someone every child should be able to count on, holding up the man as a symbol of all he should strive to please and emulate. And his mother, the primary positive influence in his life, the main significant force restraining Zuko from turning down the path that had already consumed his sister and so many of his countrymen, abruptly vanished, presumed dead after becoming entangled in court intrigue in order to protect him. The flashbacks in this episode do an excellent job at showing rather than telling, giving us a child's view of scheming and assassination, of grief and succession, making it quite clear what has happened to Ursa, Luten, and Azulon without ever directly spelling it out to the audience. Perhaps the most impactful scene is one in which a young Zuko awakens to find his sister in the doorway, childishly chanting that their father is going to kill him. After she leaves, Zuko sits alone in the dark, desperately trying to convince himself that his sister was lying. Just a confused, frightened child denied the upbringing that would have allowed him to flourish. In many ways, he still is that same frightened, confused child, as evidenced by the end of this flashback, where Zuko once more finds himself lying alone in the dark, still repeating the same empty phrase years later.
Azula always lies.
Living among the ordinary people of the Earth Kingdom, Zuko gets to experience the destruction his nation has wrought on the rest of the world firsthand. But while he had already passed through battlefields and encountered refugees, in Zuko alone this experience becomes far more personal through his connection to Lee's family. Like so many other things about this world, they are left holding on by a thread, just waiting for the blow that will shatter their tenuous existence, which comes in the news borne by the cruel militia soldiers, who tauntingly inform the family that their son's unit was captured, and will likely be slaughtered. Lee's father decides to enlist in a last-ditch effort to save his eldest son, leaving his wife distraught about their future. At this, Lee himself presses Zuko to stay, telling the Banished Prince that he reminds him of his older brother. And while it appears that a part of Zuko wants nothing more than to be able to find solace in a new family and a new life, he is not ready to let go of the identity that has been molded around him. Giving the boy a knife he received from his uncle as a parting gift, Zuko shows him the inscription, "Never give up without a fight." In a sense, the guiding words of Zuko's own life, and the best and most honest advice the exiled prince himself is capable of giving. However, just as he is about to depart the following morning, Zuko learns that Lee pulled the knife on the soldiers when they returned, and that the militia have conscripted him as punishment. Like so many other instances in his life, Zuko's attempts at helping have only made things worse. His small good deed has only caused more suffering. And I think it provides insight into how Zuko was raised that his idea of helping was to gift a warrior's knife to an untrained child. For ultimately, what was the blade meant for if not killing? This tiny interaction is emblematic of how, in this broken world, he, like so many others, unconsciously perpetuates the cycle of violence without a second thought. For while a weapon in the proper hands can be a force for good in opposing evil and defending the innocent, in the wrong hands it can just as easily make things worse. But here, unlike so many other instances throughout his past, Zuko has a chance to set things right. As Lee's desperate mother begs the exiled prince for help, after a moment of contemplation, Zuko decides to do the right thing.
I'll get your son back.
What follows is a Western-style showdown in the town square, where for the first time, we the audience get to root for Zuko not simply as the lesser of two evils, but as a genuine hero. And though we don't yet know it, this is merely a taste of things to come. Our troubled anti-hero defeats the first three soldiers with ease, but when the fourth, an earthbender, proves too formidable, Zuko is forced to reveal his true nature as a firebender. Overpowering the cruel militia captain, he stands triumphant as flames swell around him. But to Zuko, his inner strength is still corrupted, inherently tied to his old identity, and because of this, as Zuko draws upon that strength, he proudly declares himself to be the crown prince of the Fire Nation and heir to the throne, a status that by this point, only he himself and the uncle he abandoned still recognize. For despite all he has gone through, all he has experienced, Zuko's past still has far too great a hold over his present, and he clings to it rather than face the unknown future. This episode has numerous phenomenal moments, but one of the greatest is the scene that follows this misguided declaration. After learning of his true identity, the townspeople he saved instantly react not with celebration or respect, but fear and revilement. Even Lee's mother, who minutes before was tearfully begging for his help, angrily drives the fugitive prince away, while Lee, who idolized the Zuko he thought he knew, the part of Zuko that could be, now refuses to even make eye contact. This episode is a great subversion of the Western formula, by which a lone stranger with a troubled past rides into a remote town, faces down a corrupt authority, and saves its ordinary inhabitants. But it speaks volumes to the broken state of the world that when his identity is revealed, the people Zuko saved turn on him in an instant, retreating to the false security provided by the corrupt soldiers, just as Zuko himself retreats to the poisonous familiarity of his identity as Prince of the Fire Nation. Because sometimes, as is all too common in the face of abuse and trauma, it's easier to cling to the devil we know rather than embrace uncertainty, to convince ourselves that the cages erected around us, the chains that bind us, are there for our own safety. Sometimes, it's easier to just pretend. As Zuko rides off into the sunset, it is not as a hero, but as an outcast, a man with no home, no family, and no goal in mind. But in spite of all this, we the audience may feel some satisfaction that he did the right thing, and hopefully, Zuko himself does too. For while he may have little else to his name, the exiled prince has proven that despite what he, his family, or the rest of the world may believe, he does still possess honor. In many ways, Zuko alone could be considered a filler episode. After all, it has no direct bearing on the series' overarching plot, and doesn't even feature a single scene with the main heroes. But it does give us crucial insight into not only Zuko's past, but how the experiences of his youth have shaped his present. And in doing so, the show dares to touch on a subject rarely explored well or thoroughly, even in adult-centered media. A subject many understandably find disturbing, one which most people would rather not address at all. How much of what makes you, you, is determined by circumstances beyond your control? To put the question more bluntly, how far do the circumstances in which you were born and raised go to shape your very conceptions of right and wrong, of good and evil? Most people like to comfort ourselves with the idea that we would be able to make the distinction, to see through lies, to stand against injustice. But the long and bloody experience of our species' history paints a decidedly different picture. At our core, human beings are social creatures, for better and for worse. Altruistic and tribalistic. We build communities, rally together in the face of danger and tragedy, and make great sacrifices for those we consider, in myriad different ways, our own kin. And we also fall into line, adapt to our surroundings, justify our actions and the actions of those around us after the fact, and both consciously and unconsciously mold ourselves to our social environments, some of our species' greatest advantages and most terrible flaws. And yet, despite whatever inborn psychological tendencies we may find ourselves burdened with, we still have an obligation to good. In the words of the historian Christopher Browning, who has dealt extensively with the capacity of ordinary people for malevolence, human responsibility is ultimately a personal matter. While it is certainly important to condemn the evil actions of others, it is equally important to understand how the perpetrators came to do evil, and to explore the circumstances that lead many ordinary human beings down darker paths than our own, not only to help prevent such atrocities from occurring in the future, but out of an awareness for the fact that were it not for the blind luck of when and where we were born, our fates could very well have been their own. After all, as much as it might comfort us to think otherwise, even the most heinous criminals and perpetrators of the most horrific acts share in common with us their status as human beings. It is not monsters that we must remain wary of, but ourselves. Or, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn so brilliantly wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, the line separating good and evil runs not through states, nor social classes, nor political parties, but through the heart of every human being, and through all human beings. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. But even in the best of all hearts, there remains a small, unuprooted corner of evil. This moral complexity is addressed across Avatar: The Last Airbender in a variety of ways. When the heroes inadvertently find themselves caring for the infant son of a Fire Nation official, an Earth Kingdom rebel declares,
"Sure, he's cute now, but when he's older, he'll join the Fire Nation army. You won't think he's so cute then. He'll be a killer."
A notion that Katara naively has trouble accepting. Later, when Team Avatar travels through the Fire Nation incognito, they find not a country of maddened warmongers, but people very much like their own neighbors, even as they witness the early stages of the indoctrination that produces such vastly divergent results in morality. And as the return of Sozin's Comet approaches, and the group shelters in the Fire Lord's now abandoned resort home, they come across a picture of an adorable infant, believing it to be a younger image of a by then redeemed Zuko, only to learn that it is not the renegade prince, but his father, who despite beginning as an innocent child, went on to become a merciless abuser and genocidal tyrant. Likewise, our glimpses into the childhoods of both Zuko and Azula reveal not vile monsters, but relatively ordinary children. Admittedly, both possess a sense of entitlement on account of their royal status, and Azula clearly exhibits troubling tendencies, but so does her brother. When faced with anger or frustration, both choose to lash out at or exert their power over those around them, a childish trait emblematic of an underdeveloped moral character, something that can be forgiven and corrected early on in life with proper guidance. The truth is that it is easier to recognize certain types of victims than others, and it is important to remain cognizant of the fact that someone can be a victim while still committing evil acts. And in fact, they can even commit evil acts because they were originally a victim of forces beyond their control. And while this victimhood does not absolve people of their failings, it can go a long way towards helping us to understand the destructive forces that govern so many people's lives, and to work towards setting right the wrongs that have resulted. But even here, there is a hopeful takeaway. For though most abusers were themselves originally victims of abuse, most victims of abuse do not go on to abuse others. Your past does not need to define you. Arduous and painful as the process might be, the chain can be broken. And as audience members, we watch this play out in Zuko's story. Freed from the poisonous environment of his upbringing and condemned to wander as a fugitive, with even his last hope of returning home now denied him, and able to rely on the moral guidance provided first by his mother and later his uncle, Zuko finds himself more conflicted than ever before. When he comes across Aang and Azula facing off in a ghost town, he initially strikes out at both, pursuing the Avatar out of a desperate denial of his situation. But when Aang's friends arrive alongside his own uncle, Zuko instead chooses to forego his failed quest and aid them in defeating Azula, an important step in a new direction. This does not, however, mean that he has changed entirely. When Azula severely wounds Iroh, Zuko cannot bring himself to accept the aid of his longtime enemies, driving them away with a wave of flames. And when his recovering uncle instructs him in the advanced technique of redirecting lightning, which requires control and internal balance, Zuko is quick to climb to the top of a mountain in a thunderstorm, essentially daring God to strike him down, declaring with a heartbreaking mixture of pride and anguish that the world has never held anything back from him before, but now he can fight back.
Come on! Strike me! You've never held back before!
As the second season progresses, Zuko is forced to come to terms with the idea that his old life is truly lost to him, that there is no going back home, no regaining his honor, no receiving his father's love. Of course, given how turbulent his upbringing was, and given that his father, someone every child should be able to rely on for support and guidance, instead neglected, abused, and then discarded him, it's not surprising that the exiled prince remains troubled even as Iroh tries to ease him into shedding his old sense of self. Zuko remains angry and frustrated, veering between snapping at Iroh and begrudgingly accepting his uncle's plans and advice. But deep down, he is haunted by a newfound purposelessness. Even as he comes to realize the damage his father did to him, and see the devastation his own people have wrought on the rest of the world, even as he is forced to see firsthand that he is far from the only person with scars, Zuko doesn't know how to be anyone else. And even as he and his uncle settle into the Earth Kingdom capital, with the latter enthusiastically rising through the ranks of the local tea industry, Zuko cannot bring himself to feel like he belongs. It's one of the reasons his segment from the episode The Tales of Ba Sing Se is so meaningful. In it, Zuko is confronted with a very mundane situation, going on a date with a local girl. Or at least, it should be mundane. But to Zuko, raised in an abusive, controlling environment before being cast out of his homeland, simply connecting with another human being on a personal level is an alien experience. But his scars need not define him. After dropping his dour facade and mustering the strength to open up, even a little, Zuko finds it within himself to reciprocate his date's kindness, lighting a few small fires in an otherwise darkened cityscape. And at the end of the episode, he is forced to admit that his uncle, in however small a way, was right.
It was nice.
When learning that the Avatar has arrived in the city to look for his sky bison, Zuko's first instinct is to resume the pursuit that dominated so much of his life, even as he seems to know on some deeper level that it will no longer provide him a ticket home. Ignoring his uncle's pleas to move on, he infiltrates the Dai Li's headquarters and discovers a captive Appa, only to be confronted by Iroh. Here, after many years of gentle encouragement, his uncle finally resorts to brutal bluntness, asking his nephew what he plans to do now, and scolding him for never thinking things through. But his harsh words contain a glimmer of hope. It is time for Zuko to decide what he wants to do, to cast off the demands that have plagued and chained him since birth, and become the man he wants to be.
It's time for you to look inward and begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And what do you want?
And an anguished Zuko, forced to confront reality, makes yet another step towards redemption. He frees Appa, discards the blue spirit mask, the last vestige of his liminal existence as an exile with some hope for the restoration of his honor, and heads for home. Not his old home, but the new one he and his uncle have made for themselves. And for a time, embracing the simple, honest life of an ordinary man, Zuko is happy. But as many people know from painful experience, the past can rarely be escaped that easily. When his sister arrives in the city to lead a coup d'etat against the last great bastion of resistance to the Fire Nation's power, Zuko is ambushed, arrested, and imprisoned below the palace alongside Katara, one of the Avatar's closest companions. As should be expected, Katara explodes with anger at Zuko, rightly blaming him for the many horrible actions he committed in pursuit of Aang and his friends. But while justified, Katara's viewpoint is not complete, and nowhere is this more evident than when, after tearfully being told by Katara that the Fire Nation took her mother from her, Zuko finally finds the strength to respond, replying,
I'm sorry. That's something we have in common.
This is the first time in the series that Katara truly sees Zuko not merely as some malevolent force, or embodiment of the Fire Nation's aggression, but as a fellow human being, a person bearing scars much like her own. And to mirror her realization, this is the first time that Zuko openly acknowledges the wrongs that were done to him at the hands of his own father and nation. Before this moment, Zuko's suffering, his abuse, trauma, and exile had always been framed within his mind as something justified and proper, stemming from a failure on his own part, a failure to live up to the expectations of his father, to maintain his personal honor, to be the prince his country not only demanded but required. But here, in the Crystal Catacombs, sitting face to face with a longtime enemy, Zuko takes yet another crucial step towards healing. He admits, in some small way, that what was done to him was wrong. And to her credit, Katara is willing and able to look past the man who spent the last few months savagely pursuing her and her friends and see the frightened boy beneath the scarred exterior. The child who, much like her, saw his mother taken from him by a world he didn't understand. Katara admits to Zuko that, for the longest time, whenever she thought of the enemy, she would see his face, to which Zuko raises a hand to his scar and simply echoes, "My face." And in this tender moment, remembering the water she was gifted from the Spirit Oasis at the North Pole, Katara offers to attempt to heal Zuko's physical scars, just as their recognition of each other's mutual humanity and suffering has worked to mend their mental ones. They are, of course, interrupted by the arrival of Aang and Iroh, and so we never get to see if the healing water would have restored Zuko's face, because on a deeper level that's not how life works. We don't get to remove our scars, but we can learn from them, and we can build upon the damage done. And it is at this point that Zuko, after all he has learned and developed, is subjected to his greatest trial yet. When his uncle arrives alongside the Avatar, Zuko's eyes are immediately drawn to his former quarry, but Iroh, long the guiding moral light of the Banished Prince's path, restrains his nephew as Aang and Katara flee. Iroh tells Zuko that he has come to the deciding point in his life, the crossroads of his destiny. Before him stretch two very different paths, and deep down, the prince knows which is right. But their heart-to-heart is interrupted by Azula, pursuing the fleeing Avatar with the help of the Dai Li. Having toppled the central government of the Earth Kingdom, only one true threat to the Fire Nation's dominance now remains, one she is determined to stop at all costs. And so, in contrast to the peace, simplicity, and anonymity his uncle promises, Azula makes her brother a grander offer. Help me defeat the Avatar, and I will see your honor restored. It is the ultimate devil's bargain. Everything Zuko has spent years of his life seeking, everything he thought was lost to him forever, it can all be his, if he but commits this one evil act. His honor, his status, glory and public admiration, his family and home, even his father's love. When Azula leaves him to pursue the Avatar, the camera lingers on a conflicted Zuko contemplating her offer. And a short time later, as Aang and Katara battle desperately in the Crystal Catacombs, with victory hanging in the balance, Zuko bursts in between the combatants. After a moment of hesitation, pivoting between the two paths before him, Zuko's face contorts with rage, and he makes his choice. It's a devastating moment, but all the more tragic is that even as audience members condemn his decision, we cannot help but understand it. He was offered the world, if he would but bow at the feet of the devil, and how many of us could honestly say we wouldn't have done the same in his place? In the aftermath of his nephew's decision, with the Avatar struck down, presumed dead as his companions flee, Iroh refuses to speak with Zuko, or even meet his gaze directly. Sensing on some deeper level that what he has done is wrong, Zuko tells his sister that he betrayed his uncle. And true to her nature, she callously replies, "No, he betrayed you," deceptively framing Zuko's actions as him taking his destiny into his own hands, rather than him having submitted to the will of others.
Today, you restored your own honor.
In our final glimpse of the character in the second season, we see him turn away from Azula with a troubled look on his face, trying to decide which of the two viewpoints is true. Having taken the devil's bargain with his own dark mirror, Zuko finds that he now has everything he ever wanted, and this is where the brilliance of his character writing truly shines. For unlike most villains or anti-heroes who straddle the line between good and evil before eventually making a choice for the former, Zuko instead chooses the opposite. He fails his greatest test, gives in to the temptation set before him, relapses into evil, and he wins because of it. And it is not merely some short-sighted Pyrrhic victory, where he loses everything else to attain a single goal. Zuko actually regains everything he had desperately desired for so long, everything that, as far as he had been aware, was lost to him forever until just before Azula offered him that fateful choice. Zuko returns home, is greeted by his people as a conquering hero, renews his relationship with the love of his life, and is even welcomed back by his father, finally accepted by the man whose expectations he has spent his whole life trying to live up to. Zuko has every reason to be ecstatic, but something is wrong. Something feels off. He struggles to name it, tries to ignore it, spends sleepless nights pursuing it. At first, it manifests as confusion at his sister's promises being kept, and later paranoia that the Avatar might have survived. Having been given credit for striking down Aang by his sister, who then plants the seeds of fear that the boy might have survived, Zuko grows to dread that his new life might crumble to dust should the Avatar resurface. But he soon realizes that there is something more to his anguish, something deeper, something even more frightening. He begins to suspect that everything he has fought for wasn't worth it. Zuko has not only seen but lived through the suffering inflicted by his own nation on the rest of the world, has had to toil as a migrant laborer just to stave off starvation, to flee advancing armies as a refugee, to spend time getting to know ordinary people, good people, who have been scarred just like him, by people like him. The world hasn't changed, he has, and he can never go back to seeing it the way he used to. Beneath all of Zuko's other fears lurks the greatest, that this isn't what he truly wants, that it isn't right, that on that fateful day in the Crystal Catacombs, he made a terrible mistake. Throughout much of recorded history, Western cultures have tended to view good and evil in strict black and white terms, as dichotomous opposites, most famously personified in the angel on one's right shoulder and the devil on one's left. But the Eastern philosophies that the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender was inspired and shaped by tend to prioritize balance over contrast, complementary harmony over conflict, and this is perhaps best exemplified in the concept of yin and yang. Rather than viewing existence in terms of stark opposites, or dividing the world and the individuals and ideas within it into diametrically opposed categories, in many Eastern traditions, one is instead encouraged to recognize the pieces of each supposed opposite that exist in their complement. Darkness cannot exist without light. Cold cannot exist without heat. Strength cannot exist without weakness. And good cannot exist without evil. This brings us to an aspect of psychology that is central to Zuko's growth as a moral being: the concept of confronting the shadow. In the framework of Swiss psychologist and philosopher Carl Jung, the shadow is a term used to describe the part of one's personality that they remain unaware of or refuse to acknowledge consciously, often containing darker impulses and traits. And while this may make it seem entirely negative, Jung himself took inspiration from cultures across the world, including those of Eastern Asia. The Swiss psychoanalyst saw the shadow not as something to be ignored or suppressed, but rather confronted and integrated into the greater self, a process by which individuals acknowledge and assimilate the darkest aspects of their own nature to further their development as mature, balanced individuals. For example, in confronting their shadow, someone plagued by self-doubt might better understand, and thereby overcome, their own failings and insecurities, while a person prone to violence and rage might master their fiery temperament in order to utilize their strength to protect the vulnerable. But the danger in this confrontation lies in being consumed by our shadow, in giving in to our darkest impulses rather than mastering them and turning them to better use, in emboldening, and even becoming, the worst parts of ourselves. As much as we lament Zuko's decision in the Crystal Catacombs, he could not yet master his own shadow, because in a sense, he was not ready to truly confront the darkest aspects of his own soul. It is only through attaining a victory he comes to sincerely regret that the troubled prince is able to firmly set himself on the path to redemption. When faced with this peculiar newfound misery, Zuko's first instinct is to act the way he had always been encouraged to lash out at others, to blame Azula for sabotaging him, to despise Aang for surviving, even to deride his imprisoned uncle for making him weak. But, as he finally admits to his closest companions when gathered around a fire outside his family's old vacation home, in the shadow of memories of happier times, the person he is truly angriest with is himself. While many others share blame for his failings, ultimately, it is he himself who must shoulder the responsibility here and now. And in recognizing this, in confronting his own shadow, Zuko does not abandon or quell the rage that has for so long haunted and controlled him, but rather harnesses it, turning it against the darker parts of himself, as well as the broken world around him, in order to better the whole. We are not complete without our shadow, and yet if we let it rule us, if we refuse to acknowledge the darkest aspects of our own selves, we risk letting them master us. Much like with yin and yang, we must identify the positive that exists within its complement. The scars that Zuko bears are another example of this element of Eastern mysticism prevalent in Avatar. While some might associate the youthful, undamaged side of Zuko's face as being representative of his honor and innocence, the man he is meant to be, it must be remembered that this part of him was the source of much of his arrogance and cruelty. And while the scarred half of his face naturally symbolizes his trauma, it is only through enduring this trauma that he ultimately becomes a positive force in the world. Yin and Yang. Zuko's scar is an iconic aspect of the character, making him instantly recognizable while hinting at the troubled prince's past from his very first appearance, marking him as someone who has suffered great trauma and still lives with its effects. Zuko himself initially views his scar as a mark of shame, a permanent reminder of his many failings. But when forced to live as a fugitive, he finds that others rightfully recognize it as a sign of victimhood, sensing the deeper scars that exist beneath the surface. Upon seeing his face, Song attempts to connect with Zuko over their shared pain, while Lee's family avoid probing into his past out of respect. Jet recognizes a fellow victim of the Fire Nation's aggression, and Katara does as well, but where the former sees a chance for revenge against those who wronged them, the latter instead reacts with compassion and empathy, working towards healing. The reason this works so well, and connects with so many viewers, is that it touches on a greater truth, that we are rarely able to recognize our own deepest internal scars for what they really are, because by their very nature scars warp our perception of them, the world, and ourselves, often concealing, obscuring, or mischaracterizing the damage done, leaving us confused, vulnerable, and broken. It is only through his interactions with others, coupled with serious introspection, that Zuko is able to see past the surface-level damage to the wounds that lie at the heart of who he is as a person. And it is only through recognizing these wounds that he is truly able to begin to heal them. The beach episode of Avatar is unique in that while it does feature our heroes, the main plot focuses not on them but on their antagonistic counterparts, Zuko, Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee. And instead of being thrust into action-packed war zones or engaging in politicking and intrigue, we follow them as they take a vacation to Ember Island, a resort for the Fire Nation elite. Beach episodes are a common feature of many anime series, almost always consisting of fan service-heavy filler, where the heroes have some lighthearted fun before the plot resumes in the following episode. But Avatar: The Last Airbender subverts this in numerous ways, not only in following the antagonists in a mundane scenario, but in using this mundane scenario to reveal how broken they truly are. As the episode begins, the four try to have fun, with Zuko's brooding and the group's strangeness among others of their age being played for laughs. When another group of teenagers challenges them to a game of volleyball, it's easy to laugh at how brutal Azula and her companions behave in achieving victory, treating the game like they do everything else. But as the episode continues, this comical veneer gradually loses its luster, and cracks begin to show in the ruthless facade of these four villains. For it is easy to forget that these characters are only teenagers, their innocence stolen from them by circumstances of birth. Azula's clumsy attempts to flirt are initially played for laughs, but they reveal a sadder truth, that despite her power and ability, despite her charisma and skill at manipulation, when it comes to ordinary human interaction, she is utterly lost. With her confidence and charm, this should come easily to her, and yet, in a way, she's just as broken as her more openly troubled brother. In fact, they all are. these four are heirs to the greatest empire in the world, children of the ruling class, able to command armies and conquer cities, and yet the unjust war their parents have waged against the other nations has claimed a part of their humanity as its toll. Evil has always had a way of doing that. But Zuko's ability to recognize this helps to save him. As the group sit around a campfire after sunset, the vacation home that sheltered their relatively carefree childhoods looming above them in the darkness, now decrepit and crumbling, the four open up about their own insecurities, in defiance of the expectations of their culture. But where the troubled prince ultimately places the blame for his anguish on himself, thereby on some level acknowledging his own responsibility to set things right, his dark mirror takes a different approach, instead choosing to revel in his suffering rather than grapple with her own. While Zuko works to build himself up, Azula is content to tear others down. An interesting thing to note is that while Azula is often referred to as a monster, someone beyond saving, the same was said of Zuko earlier on in his own journey. And as the four sit around the fire, we glimpse what might very well be a crack in a meticulously constructed facade. Perhaps Zuko's dark mirror has chosen to neatly fit the expectations of her society, rather than find her own way, simply because this path is easier. After all, if Azula accepts the idea that she was born a monster, a sociopath without hope of redemption, then she has no true agency, and therefore no responsibility to engage in the painful soul-searching and personal growth that her brother does. The path of evil is often much easier to tread than the path of good, and by deceitfully absolving herself of all agency, Azula hopes to avoid the difficult truth that was so prominent a theme of Christopher Browning's scholarship, that human responsibility is ultimately a personal matter. In the following episode, when Zuko and Aang simultaneously learn the truth about the doomed friendship between Fire Lord Sozin and Avatar Roku, Zuko comes to understand the potential for evil that lurks within the hearts of all people. But where a capacity for evil exists, so too does a capacity for good, a hope for redemption, a chance to learn from the failures of the past, and set right the wrongs of the world here and now. In the final days before the approaching solar eclipse, a time during which firebenders will temporarily be rendered unable to bend, Zuko attends yet another war meeting with his father. This time, everything goes as it should. No codes of honor are violated, nor is Zuko condescended to or ignored. He is, in his own words, the perfect prince, everything his society tells him he should be. And yet, as he confides to Mai upon the council's conclusion,
During the meeting, I was the perfect prince. The son my father wanted. But I wasn't me.
And this is because, on a deeper level, after all he has seen and endured, all he has struggled with within his own soul, that perfect prince is not him anymore. In a sense, it never was him. And this leaves Zuko with only one choice, the choice he should have made long ago, but was unable to see for what it truly was until now. One of the most cathartic scenes in Zuko's arc is the moment during the solar eclipse in which he finally confronts his tyrannical father. After so many years of living with a poisonous mixture of fear and a desire to please, Zuko at last finds the courage to stare down his abuser, naming his father's crimes for what they are. But he doesn't merely accuse another for his failings. He also recognizes his own, and commits to making amends, to taking responsibility for the sins of his past. And when Ozai derides his pleas for peace and reconciliation with the rest of the world, mockingly observing that his uncle has gotten to him, instead of growing angry or defensive, instead of mistaking a desire for harmony and understanding with weakness, as his father and so many others do, Zuko simply smiles before proudly declaring,
Yes, he has.
After goading Zuko into remaining until the eclipse has ended, at which point he hopes his own power will be enough to overwhelm the son he now views as an irredeemable failure, Ozai strikes out at the renegade prince with a blast of deadly lightning, only for Zuko, employing the technique his uncle showed him, to redirect it, displaying not just his newfound internal balance, but giving audiences a powerful demonstration of his ability to learn and grow. In the aftermath of the Coalition's defeat on the Day of Black Sun, as the Avatar and his closest companions flee, Zuko once again sets out in pursuit, though this time it is not with the goal of capturing Aang, but teaching him. And though the others are naturally reluctant to trust the Fire Nation Prince, his commitment to aiding them, combined with selfless dedication in the face of a threat, and Aang's need for a firebending master, leads to him being accepted within the group. But just because he has found himself on the right path does not mean that Zuko is entirely free of his flaws. He still struggles with anger, being quick to lose his patience and lash out. Only now he recognizes the dangers inherent in these behaviors, rather than indulging them. And through his interactions with the Avatar and his companions, they assist one another in coming to understand both themselves and the world at large, and work side by side towards righting the many wrongs within it. Upon finding that confronting his own demons has rendered him unable to firebend, Zuko embarks on a journey with Aang to discover the original source of the art. Not the corrupted, rage-fueled form his nation presently encourages, but one based on internal balance, treating fire not as a weapon of destruction, but as a spark of life. With Sokka, Zuko proves his willingness to risk his own well-being for his companions and their family and friends. While with Katara, after aiding her in tracking down and confronting the man who killed her mother, Zuko not only helps his new friend deal with her scars, but demonstrates the importance of not being consumed by anger, and in exchange receives the forgiveness he so desperately desires. It is not enough that Zuko decides to be good now. He actively works to right the wrongs of the past that he played a part in committing. Beginning as a dark mirror for the hero of the story, by its end, Zuko comes to be saved by his admission of weakness, and the necessity for personal growth, which stands in stark contrast to the fate of his own dark mirror, his sister Azula. Where Zuko confronts and tames the darkness within his soul, Azula both nourishes and is nourished by it. Where her brother heeds his guilt in finding a better path, she suppresses hers as a sign of weakness. Where he finds the courage to reach out to and rely on others, she shuts herself off from them, seeing other people as little more than accessories to her own power. Valuing intimidation through strength over genuine personal connection, as her brother gains and deepens his friendships, Azula ultimately finds that those around her choose their love of others over their fear of her. And having fully embraced the ruthless persona that her father and society encouraged, the persona Zuko himself previously wanted nothing more than to successfully adopt, Azula cannot fathom how to handle these betrayals, spiraling into paranoia and bitterness as her brother finds belonging, purpose, and inner peace. Where Zuko embraces the love others have shown him, even when, as in the case of his uncle, it is cloaked in justified disappointment at his mistakes, Azula recoils from it, growing furious at merely imagining her mother's assurances that despite Azula's flaws, she still loves her daughter. As the return of Sozin's Comet approaches, heralding the climactic showdown that the entire series has been building towards, Zuko is finally reunited with the uncle who proved so pivotal in his redemption. An anxious Zuko struggles to profess his sorrow and shame at having betrayed his uncle, only to find himself being warmly embraced. And when Zuko asks how he could be forgiven so easily, and says that he thought his uncle would be furious, Iroh replies,
"I was never angry with you. I was sad because I was afraid you lost your way.
I did lose my way.
But you found it again. And you did it by yourself."
And though Zuko certainly did have help finding the right path, ultimately, it was he who made the choice to walk it. In the end, he proved to be the architect of his own redemption, and the master of his own destiny. In the 4-part finale, as Aang battles the Fire Lord turned Phoenix King, and Sokka, Toph, and Suki take on the Air Fleet, Zuko and Katara travel to the Fire Nation capital to prevent Azula's ascension to the throne. And while the other elements of this finale certainly contain plenty of character investment, tension, and excitement, for me and many others, the highlight of the series is found not in the Avatar's battle against Ozai, but here, in the dramatic confrontation between Zuko and his sister, the last Agni Kai. Zuko faces down his own dark mirror, a sobering reminder of what very well could have been his own fate. And while we the audience naturally cheer for the young prince against his malevolent, sociopathic sister, with its intense flares of blue and red fire clashing together, underscored by the slow, dramatic theme. The entire affair is tragic rather than triumphant in nature. These two combatants are lifelong enemies, but it must be remembered that they are also siblings, two people who should have been compatible, who should have been able to rely on one another, who should never have been brought to this. Whether we can truly say that Azula chose her path or was set on it by forces beyond her control is now irrelevant. For while the pair shared a starting point, their two paths have long since diverged. In a final show of this, when a desperate Azula treacherously fires a bolt of lightning at Katara in violation of the rules of Agni Kai, Zuko selflessly leaps in front of his friend, left to writhe in pain on the ground as electricity racks his body. The prince who began his journey as a selfish and belligerent adolescent, desperate for approval and glory, is now willing to give up his claim to the throne, and indeed lay down his life for another. But while he ends up being healed by a friend, his sister is left to wallow in impotent rage, straining futilely against both her physical and mental bonds, alone, powerless, and broken. And in the aftermath of the last Agni Kai, when Zuko finally ascends to the throne, he does so not to follow in the footsteps of his warmongering, villainous forefathers, as his sister had sought to, but to forge a new path of peace and reconciliation, a path others helped to reveal, but he chose to tread. Out of what I consider to be the 6 best episodes of the series, I think it is no coincidence that Zuko proves instrumental to the plot in 4 of them, one of which features him to the exclusion of the main heroes, and receives meaningful development in one of the other 2. While there are certainly many reasons that fans continue to return to Avatar: The Last Airbender, even a decade and a half after it debuted, I believe one of the central appeals of the series remains the arc of the Banished Prince. Zuko's story, brutal and tragic as much of it is, ultimately proves optimistic, providing hope to us that despite our failings or flaws, despite the hardships we endure, despite the scars that appear to define us, even despite the pain we in our confused and wounded states inflict on others, there is still a way back to the light, so long as we have the strength, honesty, and courage to seek it. And therein lies the brilliance of Zuko's story.
Honor, 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 honor.
It's okay. You can laugh. It's funny.
My name is Ong. And I'm the Avatar. I ran away, but I'm back now.
Are you the Avatar, Ong?
I always knew you return.
Me too.
Firelord's son. You took him from our...
Well, that's just silly. I don't sound like that.
Oh man, this writer's a genius!
That wasn't a good play.
I'll say.
No kidding. Horrible. You said it.
But the effects were decent. Hello, little weird fox guy.
All right, go with that. Everybody freestyle.
Take your hands off your